Okay, hello everyone. Very warm welcome to this evening's conversation with Catherine Belton on her wonderful book, Putin's People. We are still waiting for, we anticipate, another 50 people to join us. But whilst we wait for them to join, I will just take you through a few bits of housekeeping before I hand over to Craig Kennedy, who's the chair of the Pushkin House trustees and who will be in conversation with Catherine this evening. The first thing to mention is that we are recording the online event. So if you don't want to appear in any way in the recording, then please make sure that your cameras are switched off. We will actually be emailing out to everyone who's registered for the event, the recording, which you'll have available to watch for 72 hours. After you've received it. The other key thing, of course, is to mention that if you have any questions for Catherine, please do put them in the chat as we go along, as they occur to you, and we'll do our best to get through them once the initial conversation between Catherine and Craig is over. I think that's it. It's wonderful to welcome Catherine. And I think, yes, we've got 157 people and rising, but I'll hand over to Craig, I think.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us at Pushkin House this evening virtually. We're very fortunate to have with us tonight Catherine Belton, veteran journalist and author of the recently published book, Putin's People, How the KGB Took Back Russia and then Took on the West. Catherine's book has met with critical acclaim and addresses some of the great questions of our day. How did Vladimir Putin and an inner circle of supporters from the Russian security services manage to gain power in Russia? And what challenges does their rise pose to Western societies? The book represents investigative journalism at its very finest. It's based on an extensive collection of interviews taken over many years with a colorful cross-section of Russian insiders, Kremlin operatives, well-connected business figures, members from the Russian intelligence agencies, and even the Russian underworld. They give us unparalleled insights into the inner machinations of recent Kremlin politics. And Catherine weaves them all together in an elegantly written narrative that is vivid and engrossing. So welcome, Catherine, to this Pushkin House book talk. Let's start a bit with learning about you. Your interest in Russia dates back many years. You read Russian at university, you did postgraduate work in Russian politics. You've spent some 20 years as a journalist covering Russia. Tell us, what drew you into the Russian journalism beat in the first place?
Thank you so much for such a great introduction. I'm really glad to be joining you this evening, and especially to be discussing all this with you, because I know that you know your stuff better than anyone else. So I'm very glad to be discussing it with you this evening. I think I was drawn to Russia like many of my generation in that period. I was kind of finishing school just as the Soviet Union was collapsing. I went to Moscow in December '91, where for the first time Russians were gathering on Red Square to celebrate New Year's Eve, and it was just like entering a different world that was entrancing and sort of incredibly puzzling and really gripping and addictive at the same time, because all the stories were always larger than life and the stakes were always larger than life too, because the scale of the change and the upheaval was just so sweeping. So I felt myself very lucky to be able to go and study Russian at university and then go back and visit the country and eventually work there.
I think your Russian language skills and your deep knowledge of Russia must have helped with the next question I want to ask you. And that is about these amazing sources that you put together. Anyone who reads this book is just swept away by the vast number of interviews that you conducted over 15 plus years with this amazing array of characters. Many of them would normally shun a journalist and would not be willing to disclose some of the inner workings of the Kremlin. There's a quote that comes to mind, however, as I read your book, and it's often attributed, perhaps apocryphally, to Churchill, that Russian politics is a bit like dogs fighting underneath a carpet. You know something is going on, but you can't quite tell. But when you read your book, because of the glimpses, the insights you've gotten from some of your sources, for a moment that carpet gets pulled away and we can see how things played out over the years. Can you tell us a bit more about how you developed relationships with your sources and how you were able to get such wonderful access?
Again, I was very lucky because for about 7 years I was working as the Moscow correspondent for the Financial Times, and that automatically grants you considerable access to quite senior government officials and to senior Russian businessmen, especially in the era that I was working in Moscow, which was 2007 to 2013, which was almost a different world then, because it was before the great standoff over Ukraine with the West. People were much more accessible. Much of my work then was during the Medvedev era, when Russia was much more friendly towards the West, and the oligarchs in particular wanted to make a good impression, especially on the pages of the Financial Times. So this sort of gave me an in and helped me establish relationships. And then when I went off to work on my book, I was able to continue those relationships, first when I was researching in Moscow, and then in St. Petersburg when I was trying to dig into Putin's past there. But eventually, yes, there did come a moment sort of during the height of the Ukraine standoff, after the annexation of Crimea, as sanctions were being imposed. My sources became more and more uncomfortable about meeting with me. I think the atmosphere really did become very different. Things got much colder. So I decided to come back to London thinking, oh, I'll be able to finish my book really quickly and move on to the next task. But I got back to London and found there were even more fascinating characters here who were, some of them in exile, who had really great insights into sort of Putin and how the Kremlin operated, especially in the early years of his regime. And I also found that a lot of my Moscow sources were also coming in and out of London all the time, and were in fact much more willing to speak to me here than they had been in Moscow, because they were far away from anyone sort of peering over their shoulder.
It's an incredible achievement, and we all benefit from much of what you've been able to coax out of these interesting people. You talked about looking into Putin's past, and it's interesting that your book actually starts way back in the 1980s, perhaps a bit earlier than people might have expected. And you start by telling about the challenge that the Soviet Union was facing with a stagnating economy up against more dynamic economies in the West, and that there were certain better informed members of the Kremlin elite, or the Soviet elite, I should say, some economists and more reform-minded politicians who sensed the crisis brewing and knew something that had to be done. But among those potential reformers were also some senior KGB intelligence officers. Could you tell us a bit more about the challenges they saw and what type of reform they set out to implement, and maybe how it turned out, at least initially?
Yeah, I think that especially the foreign intelligence arm of the KGB could really see that the Soviet planned economy was no longer up to the task. I mean, they had visions of being this great global empire. They'd been using sort of front companies and slush funds for many decades to try and fund their battle for global supremacy against the West. They'd been using intermediaries and front companies to funnel funds into communist parties in the West and try to rig elections in their favor. And they'd also been using various front companies to fund subversive elements against the West too. But there was a long period of low oil prices. They realized the Soviet economy was running on empty, that the planned economy just wasn't competitive against the West, that they were so far behind technologically, they were never going to be able to compete against the West militarily. militarily. And so they knew that essentially they had to do something to make the economy more competitive. And one of these guys who worked with the foreign intelligence operatives then, he said, look, if you want to have ambitions of being a great global empire, you have to have huge amounts of funds to do so. And it was clear to us that was no longer within our means. And so they began this sort of process of reform. They wanted to bring the market to the Soviet economy, but I think they hoped to do so in a much more controlled way than the one that eventually turned out. I mean, I think no one really knew how to do this. So they experimented and they began sort of opening up the Soviet economy to some elements of competition. And they did so through cultivating a new cadre of entrepreneurs. They drew on people from the Communist Youth League, the Komsomol, people like Mikhail Khodorkovsky or Mikhail Friedman, the tycoons, the oligarchs that we know of today, who were then very young students and were allowed to sort of dabble first in the black market, and then they were given sort of access to some of the huge funds that the Communist Party had at its command, and they were also given access to some of them to trading in raw materials. The first task was to import computers, but because of the great disparity in the exchange rates, they were able to make quite a pretty penny on this, and they were able to sort of begin to be the kind of the first sort of entrepreneurs of this era. But as the KGB and who were really in charge of foreign trade then, you had to work with them in order to be able to do any trade at all. As they began sort of opening up the market to greater competition, of course, sort of a gold rush started. Everyone wanted to make money, and it kind of span a little bit out of their control. I mean, they were kind of watching over the young cadre of entrepreneurs, but then the Soviet Red directors were trying to join the gold rush, and some of their number were also joining the gold rush, and some of them were siding with Yeltsin, for instance, over Gorbachev, whose efforts of reform were very half-hearted. One of them said they could see Gorbachev's efforts to move to a socialist kind of type of market economy was going to be as effective as fried snowballs. So some of them were, the whole kind of the elite was cracking, and some of them were joining Yeltsin and supporting him over Gorbachev.
So they know change is necessary. They try to introduce some element of market dynamism. They recruit in a group of talented entrepreneurial types to help them with this, since I guess the average case officer at that point hadn't necessarily been trained in how to start up a company or how to make it more competitive, although some of them proved to be remarkably adept at it once they got their hands on some assets. If we take this a bit further forward, after the breakup of the Soviet economy, this gold rush ensues. What then happens in the dynamics between the hired help, as it were, these talented young entrepreneurs, and some of the senior security officials who had hoped to maintain control over this new dynamo that they'd put in place?
Yeah, that's a good question, because once Yeltsin came to power, the paradigm started to shift. I think the KGB sort of remained in the background, and some of them were hoping that they would be able to keep control of some of the cash flows, but they didn't know how to manage these huge Soviet enterprises. Lots of them were just sort of going to ruin and building up ever greater debts as the economy kind of spiraled into chaos. They were trying to maintain control over oil exports and metals exports, but they couldn't. And the big paradigm shift really came as the young tycoons who were under Yeltsin gaining access to more and more cash, first through their banks. They were given access to government deposits, which allowed them to create enormous wealth just through having access to government budget funds, because that was a time, as you know, of hyperinflation. So they could make huge amounts just on the exchange rate alone. And once they had access to that money, they were in prime position really to take over the biggest assets of the Soviet Union's industrial wealth, and they were able to do so in the loans for shares scheme, which was when they were able to essentially purchase the prime industrial assets of the Soviet Union at a knockdown price. And really that's when the paradigm shifted, and it really irked the security service men, who kind of basically thought, hey, these young tycoons, they've forgotten to whom they owe a debt. They kind of forgot who helped them on their way in the first place, and that was sort of sowed the seeds for the future conflict that we saw with the Putin regime.
Mm-hmm. So there are hopes for reform that might end up with a more dynamic economy, but still controlled by a state elite, I guess what we'd call state capitalism as such. Didn't work out by the mid-90s, at least for a moment it hadn't, because the hired help they brought in actually ended up taking over the show and running it according to their own lights. Why don't we pause with that part of your story for a moment and bring in Vladimir Putin. He, I guess, technically wasn't part of the senior elite of the foreign intelligence agencies at this point. He was still relatively junior coming out of his years in Dresden. But he then lands a job with the dynamic mayor, Anatoly Sobchak, in St. Petersburg in the early 1990s. And he has the difficult task of running the relationship between the city government and many of the local and international business elements, which, as we know, were at least the local business elements were riddled with crime at that point. Can you talk a bit more about his experience then, and what sort of formative effects these might have had on him?
Yeah, I think those the St. Petersburg years really did kind of sort of forge his persona, and kind of were a kind of template for how he was to run the country on a federal scale. He was very much in the background in the beginning, sort of running things behind the scenes. His mentor, the city's mayor, Anatoly Sobchak, was a rousing orator, but he really didn't like to get his hands dirty running the city's day-to-day business, so he left that to his deputies, and one of them was Vladimir Putin. And he very much became the interface between the city government and the security services, the law enforcement structures they needed. Sobchak definitely needed someone to be able to do that, because I heard from ex-KGB officials there that nobody wanted to speak to Sobchak. They thought he was vain, that he was foppish, and he didn't want to get his hands dirty, and they preferred to talk to Vladimir Putin, or Volodya, who they called him then, because he understood their language. They would say that if you wanted to talk about Sobchak, about issues of security, it would be like trying to speak about nuclear physics with him. It was absolutely pointless. So they turned to Putin, and I think Putin and the security cadre around him very quickly understood that they wanted to maintain control of the city's strategic cash flows, that this was very important just from the point of view of being able to preserve and maintain their own intelligence networks. So Putin himself very much continued to work with this sort of cadre of ex-KGB officers that he'd known in Leningrad in the 70s, that he'd worked with then, even before he'd headed off to Dresden, and he maintained very close ties with them. There was Viktor Cherkesev, who was head of the city's security service, and together they began to sort of pick off the main assets of the city, and prime among them was the city's seaport. And the way in which they did this was, it was kind of very instructive for what was to happen later. They arrested the head of the Baltic Sea Fleet, and in those days the Sea Fleet encompassed the seaport, the oil terminal, and hundreds of tankers who were kind of bringing in most of the city's wealth in those days. The director of the Sea Fleet was arrested, spent 4 months in jail, jail. When he was finally released on bail, he found that he was no longer director of the Sea Fleet, and that the entire Sea Fleet was being carved up, sold off to offshore jurisdictions, and the seaport and the oil terminal were being sort of carved out from under this holding company as well. And of course, this was also a time of great chaos, and St. Petersburg, more than many other cities, was riddled with organized crime, and they also made a beeline for the seaport and the oil terminal, because this was the city's main source of cash, and and it was a great hub for contraband and for smuggling. But I think Putin and his security men, they knew from their time in the KGB that the oil cash, the strategic cash flows were very important, and they needed to maintain some hold on it. And at some point they decided, well, if you can't beat them, you join them. So they essentially forged an alliance with the city's most powerful organized crime group, the Tambov, and together they jointly ran the seaport and the oil terminal. And some of Putin's men were like Gennady Timchenko, who later became sort of the third biggest oil trader in the world under Putin's presidency. He had a monopoly on the St. Petersburg oil terminal by dint of his good relations with Putin, and indeed his ability to work with some of the more shadowy figures behind the scenes. And so Putin was there handing out licenses and allowing the Tambov to operate. And essentially, as one former oil executive who worked there put it, that they were one team, they were working together to run the city. And so indeed, some of one ex-Moscow senior KGB officer sort of balked at some of these tactics. He said, look, these St. Petersburg security service guys, they're much more ruthless than the Moscow ones. They have a chip on their shoulder, they have an inferiority complex, as they're not as well educated as we are, and essentially they'll stop at nothing to attain and hold on to power. And again, I think that's very instructive for how we've seen Putin run the country as well since he came to power.
So a very instructive period for learning the statecraft of managing politics, business, and power and money in a difficult environment with relatively loose laws or weak legal system. So Putin seems to be going from strength to strength in St. Petersburg. But then the wheels of democracy turn, and Anatoly Sobchak, his political patron, loses the mayoral election in 1996 by, I think it's 1.2%, and surrenders power. But Putin's without a job. He's quickly headhunted by the Kremlin now and brought into a relatively unglamorous job looking after state property. But in a remarkable turn of fate, within 3+ years, he has been anointed as Boris Yeltsin's successor. And I found this one of the most interesting parts of your book, because the story you tell is one that's I haven't come across before, that suggests that there was a cohort of security services people who were actively working to weaken the Yeltsin regime and to support their dark horse candidate, Vladimir Putin, within the inner sanctums of the Kremlin. And that Putin himself demonstrated here a facility that many people have attributed to him before, this chameleon-like quality to be different things to different people. And that while to the Yeltsin clan, he appeared to be a loyal and competent state functionary, in reality, he was very much in league with some of the security services who were seeking to regain the reins of power, having been effectively squeezed out by the Yeltsin clan on the one side, and the new breeds of oligarchs who had previously been the hired help of the security services. At least some of them had been.
Yeah, that's.
How did Putin do it?
Yeah, I think, I mean, obviously a lot of it is kind of political chance. A lot of it is, but part of it is also calculation. So, I mean, these things never happen on their own. There's always an element of calculation. There's always an element of chance, and Putin happened to get lucky. So he rose very rapidly, as you stated, through the ranks of the Kremlin, and probably he did so because he was so unassuming. He kind of presented himself as being uniquely unambitious. Valentin Yumashev, who was then the Kremlin chief of staff, sort of remarked about how in 97, when Putin was his deputy chief of staff, that Putin had essentially said, look, I think I've achieved everything that I can now. It's time for me to retire. And in those days, this was a very rare statement to hear indeed, because obviously Russian politics was a den of vipers, and here was someone who was voluntarily saying it's time for me to bow out. But instead of bowing out, he was promoted further to first deputy chief of staff, where he began to get more access to Yeltsin. That post lasted only a few months before he was bumped even higher up to head of the FSB. And these were times of great chaos, as you know, for the Yeltsin regime. They were hurtling towards the August 98 financial crisis, which left Yeltsin severely dented. It left him hostage to the communist-dominated Duma. Yeltsin was forced into backing former spy master Yevgeny Primakov as his prime minister, and in the background he was facing an insurrection and a real threat to his family. I mean, it sounds like nothing compared to the corruption scandals of nowadays, but in those days it was really an existential threat to his family, because a former KGB officer in Switzerland who I found out had known Putin since the St. Petersburg years and had worked with him then on various oil for food barter schemes, had been sort of sitting on a piece of compromat, on compromising information against the Yeltsin family, which was their use of credit cards, which had been handed to them by a Swiss company, which had won the multi-billion-dollar contract to reconstruct the Kremlin. And of course, the sums that the Yeltsin family had spent on these credit cards were minuscule. It was perhaps a couple of $100,000 at most. But in those days, when the communist-dominated Duma was already threatening to impeach Yeltsin, the game plan was for Primakov to stand up during the impeachment hearings or before and sort of wave the credit cards and say, look, the president is a thief and so is his family. There was a criminal case. The Russian prosecutor general, as you know, Yuri Skodartov, was pursuing criminal charges. And really, the Yeltsin family were really worried about what was going to happen, and so they were casting about for potential solutions. Yeltsin's choice, he managed to oust Primakov, who was the most immediate danger to him, who was a very powerful political force at the time. Yeltsin's choice was to have another general take over as prime minister. This was Sergei Stepashin, but he was the general of the Silovik, the security man, who was the most liberal of all. He was a member of the liberal Yabloko party. Yeltsin had known and trusted him since the early 90s. But the Yeltsin family, Yeltsin's daughter and Valentin Yumashev, and also another shadowy figure, Sergei Pugachev, feared that Stepashin was too weak, that he would do deals with the communists and he wouldn't be able to protect the Yeltsin family. And so Putin was very quietly propelled forward as an alternative. At that time, he was heading a big security structure of his own, the FSB. One of the first things he did when he was propelled into the position of prime minister was to open a criminal case against one of Yeltsin's rivals, and this probably helped him along the way. But he'd also displayed this very chameleon-like quality, which made the Yeltsin family believe that not only could he protect them, but he was somebody who was going to continue Yeltsin's legacy, that he paid lip service to the ideals of democracy He'd even apparently told Yumashev that he'd been shocked when Yevgeny Primakov, as prime minister, had asked him to bug the telephone of Grigory Yablinsky, the leader of the Yabloko party, and that he'd sort of said, we can't return to these traditions of these Soviet traditions because we'll undermine our security service if we start bugging the telephones of political leaders. This will undermine our democracy. And of course, this sounds incredible when we know what Putin has been up to in recent times, but Yumashev took it at face value, and he believed that Putin was a liberal. They thought he was young, that he was progressive, and that also that they could control him. They thought that he was somebody, because he'd been so unassuming, so uniquely unambitious. Indeed, when he was handed the role of prime minister and then Yeltsin's successor, he was very reluctant, or he said he was reluctant to take the role on. But essentially, all the while, he was being, so Tom Graham, the former NSC director for Russia, said that essentially if it wasn't Putin, it would have been another security service official, and another ex-senior KGB official told me this, that the Yeltsin family had to find a compromise with the security services, that all the while behind the scenes in the 90s, they remained a force to be reckoned with, and these were the ones that they had to deal with. So perhaps it was a little bit of chance that it ended up being Putin, but he was certainly in the right place at the right time, and he displayed these very unique qualities that allowed him to kind of attain the trust of the Yeltsin family.
So luck in this case favored the well-prepared and the well-positioned.
Mm-hmm.
So he comes to power, and it's not just Putin who comes to power, it's his whole inner group of security officials, many of whom in some ways are even more ambitious and perhaps even more ruthless than he was in his early years. You paint a portrait of a man who sometimes is actually a bit hesitant. He's perhaps risen to power so quickly, it's such a meteoric rise, he's not quite certain how to manage a crisis such as we saw early on with the sinking of the Komsomolsk. He is uncertain about how to go about tackling and bringing down the oligarchs, and he's constantly being bucked up by some of his more ardent inner sanctum. But as the next few years go by, he becomes more comfortable in the role, more confident, and he learns how to manipulate the rules of statecraft more effectively to get his way. And then, of course, we get to the Yukos affair, which you point to as a major landmark or inflection point in the development of the Putin system of political control within Russia, Sistema, as people would often call it. What happened in the Yukos affair that made it so important in the development of the system that has continued on in various permutations ever since?
Yeah, it was really the turning point that changed everything. It was the moment when Putin and his KGB cohort realized that they had been able to subvert the rule of law, to jail the tycoon who at that time was Russia's richest, who owned the country's biggest oil major. I think they'd long been sort of eyeing ways to, again, as they had in St. Petersburg, to take control of the country's strategic cash flows, and oil for the KGB, even sort of in the Soviet period, had always been sort of currency to use in geopolitical power games, and they saw it as this kind of major kind of strategic asset that they had to control. But there was Khodorkovsky, who was the country's richest man, and he was refusing to kowtow to the Kremlin. He was not only trying to sell control of his oil company to the United States, he was also trying to build pipelines that were out of control of the state, an independent pipeline that would funnel oil to China and also to the West. He was in Putin's eyes, he was out of control, and he was sort of making sort of a great show as well of cultivating Western leaders and Western officials, and this was almost like a red rag to a bull for the security men. And he would obviously, and if he'd been able to sell control of UKUS or even a minority stake to Chevron or Exxon, as the negotiations had been sort of going on at the time, then he would have walked out, of course, with billions that it seemed that he was going to pour into opposition parties, which he was already actively funding in the Duma. And I think the Kremlin and Putin were just of a mindset, of kind of quite a paranoid mindset, that Khodorkovsky would seek to topple them at some point. And indeed, Khodorkovsky himself had said that he might stand down as chief executive of UKUS, his oil major, in 2008, and he was clearly signaling that he might then run for the presidency. So I think they, on the one hand, they saw it as an existential threat, but also it was an excuse to kind of go after him and take down the country's richest man. And of course, then we had this long saga of the cooking up of retroactive tax charges against Khodorkovsky, his jailing on fraud and embezzlement charges for schemes, tax schemes that many of the other oil companies had engaged in at the time, including Sibneft, including Lukoil. Sibneft had paid an even lower effective tax rate than Khodorkovsky's UKUS had, and yet Roman Abramovich, the Sibneft owner, never faced any jail time or threats the way that Khodorkovsky did. And it was really the moment when Khodorkovsky was arrested in October 2003, and then the Kremlin sort of began this kind of death by 1,000 cuts, sort of cautious, in the beginning, very cautious takeover of his oil company. That was the moment when they realized that they could exercise control over the country's legal system, the law enforcement system, to take over a prime asset and get away with it and keep the West on board at the same time, because they were quite cautious in the beginning, not like we see them act today, because they very much wanted to retain legitimacy in the eyes of the West. So they were cautiously kind of proceeding with back tax charges, which only escalated at the last minute once the West had already gotten used to the idea that the Kremlin might take over UKUS. And essentially it was the moment when they realized that for the West, perhaps these sort of ideals of rule of law and sort of these democratic niceties perhaps matter less than the pursuit of profit, because even as officials in the US State Department were warning about the impact on the investment climate of any takeover of UKUS, Western oil companies were lining up to take a slice of the pie. So I think it was very instructive for them as to where the weaknesses of the Western system were, and their ability to essentially, one, take over the country's biggest asset and sort of cow the rest of the nation's oligarchs along the way, because of course they saw what happened to Khodorkovsky and realized a similar fate could await any one of them if they didn't carefully toe the Kremlin line.
So in your fascinating description of the UKUS affair, and I recall this is one of the big stories that you'd covered early on in your journalism career, so you know it well. You describe a Kremlin which is not entirely confident that they'll be able to manage the judges to say and do things that they wanted them to say and do. And that one of the things that they develop greater skill at over the course of the UKUS affair is this matter of telephone justice, how to work effectively with the judicial system to make certain the outcome goes the way that is politically expedient for the Kremlin. But you say that this death by 1,000 cuts, this long drawn out legal process, also helped create a semblance of due process and adherence to law, which is intended to give more comfort or a fig leaf to Western companies that wanted to still feel that if it was safe to invest in Russia. And then at that point in time, keeping Russian investment or foreign investment on board was a high priority to Putin. But then I guess the next and perhaps the final major turning point in the story comes, and that is this souring of relations with the West, both politically and eventually commercial relations sour as a result of souring political relations and rising political risk. Can you tell us a bit about that, and in particular, the role of the Orange Revolution in 2006?
Yeah, I think they really feared. I think again we sort of just only we just really have to understand the mindset of Putin's people, the ex-KGB officers who came to power with them. They watched sort of decades of covert electoral interference battles between the Soviet Union and the West, and they kind of just couldn't shake off the belief that the West was continuing these games even after the Soviet Union's fall, that the West was trying to encircle Russia, that the West had engineered the Orange Revolution as a means to prize Ukraine away from Russia, and really Ukraine was this sort of vital kind of a sphere of interest for Russia, where a lot of its defense, well, lots of connected defense producers were based, and it was also a vital transit corridor for the supply of gas into Europe. So they really kind of prized maintaining influence, of course, over Ukraine. But I think, you know, and once the pro-Kremlin kind of Viktor Yanukovych, who was the pro-Kremlin candidate in 2004, once he was toppled, and the sort of much more Western-leaning alliance of Viktor Yushchenko and Yulia Tymoshenko came to power, it was really such a very big warning sign to the Kremlin. They believed that perhaps that other color revolutions, such as the Rose Revolution in Georgia, was also aimed at encircling Russia, and then next would be Russia itself in the sort of line of Western-stoked so-called democratic revolutions. And it kind of colored many of their actions, actually right down to dictating the exact sentence Khodorkovsky should be given in his fraud case, because they wanted to make sure that he wasn't out of jail before 2008, which was when the next presidential elections were scheduled. And I'm told precisely that section said that he has to remain in jail, otherwise we'll face an Orange Revolution here. So they were driven by this kind of deep paranoia. It colored their actions, but it also inspired some of the first kind of real kind of coercive actions towards the near neighbors. We know, of course, that Russia cut off gas supplies to Ukraine in January 2006, and this cut-off of gas supplies and the deal that was arranged as a result became a means of essentially tarnishing the team, the pro-Western team that was running Ukraine then. It was like sort of an interesting experiment in sort of the Kremlin's flexing of its energy muscles for the first time. So you will remember, of course, the cutoff of gas and the deal that Viktor Yushchenko agreed to in order to get the gas supplies restored, and that was to anoint a kind of Kremlin-connected gas trader, Rosukrenergo, which was essentially quite a shadowy middleman involved in funneling gas from Turkmenistan and other Central Asian countries, mixing it with more expensive Russian gas, and then essentially winning a monopoly on gas supplies to Ukraine, which allowed it in quite a shadowy way to potentially walk away with billions of dollars in profits. And once Yushchenko had agreed to this deal, it became a signal to many in the West, including the US ambassador to Kiev at the time, that perhaps Yushchenko had taken kickbacks in return for agreeing to this deal. And we don't have any concrete proof whether he did or not, but it certainly tarnished his reputation as the entire deal was decried by his own allies, including Yulia Tymoshenko. She called it a cancer on our system, and that claimed it was very openly corrupt, and so began the basic breakdown of the Orange Revolution team. And it didn't take long before Yushchenko was out of power because his reputation had been tarnished. But it was the penetration of Ukraine through a deal that looked to be corrupting the country's leadership through an alliance, again, of KGB with organized crime, because we've all heard, of course, that the one of the owners of Rosukrernego, Dmitry Firtash, he admitted himself to one US ambassador to Ukraine as according to a cable that was leaked in WikiLeaks, that he had been sort of allowed into the gas trade through his partnership with Simeon Mogilevich, a very powerful organized crime figure, though he's since tried to backtrack from these statements.
Mm-hmm. So Ukraine and the color revolution has a major impact on Russia's perception of the benefits of a relationship with the West. I've got a couple more questions that I'd like to ask you before opening up the floor to everyone and going through some of the questions which are coming through on chat. But I'd like to take this opportunity to repeat a message from the outset for those who didn't hear it. We are accepting questions through chat. So if you'd like to pose a question to Catherine, please type your message in and we'll try and include it in the list. So the relation with the West is soured after the Orange Revolution, or begins its downward spiral. Can you characterize what other changes happen in the relationship with the West? In particular, this somewhat concerted effort at building networks of influence in the West, especially among people who either are strongly interested in continuing to do business in Russia and have influence among Western politicians, but also among groups which are both opposed to integration of the EU and are generally considered to be anti-democratic or reactionary. Can you talk a bit about the Kremlin's attitude toward in a way, rebuilding the very networks that some of the senior intelligence cohorts had been running back in the 1980s?
Yeah, it's sort of, again, Ukraine became this inflection point whereby the Kremlin began sort of creating sort of its own NGOs and non-for-profit organizations in Ukraine, first of all, in particular, that would sort of counter some of the Western operators involved in that era. They wanted to create their own sort of anti-George Soros groups that would kind of promote this idea of restoring Russian empire, and they had sort of Alexander Dugin and his Eurasian youth movement, for instance. And very slowly there was Vladimir Putin, who was the head of the state railways, and he began creating an Orthodox charity which was designed to sort of spread a kind of traditionalist conservative ideas in Europe, but was also kind of, you know, funding some of these groups too. But the main actor was Konstantin Malafeev, whose rise came perhaps a little later down the line. He was a very orthodox Russian banker, and he was given access to huge amounts of state funds through Rostelecom, the state telecoms monopoly. And he was essentially awarded a stake through a loan from Gazprom Bank, which was one of Putin's, the Putin regime's crony banks, headed by a former foreign intelligence operative. And he was given a loan to acquire this stake again at a low price, and then allowed to sell it a few years later for $700 million, which he said he was going to spend on humanitarian projects. And it turned out many of these humanitarian projects were funding kind of, well, as many of the pro-Kremlin separatist groups that we saw active after the annexation of Crimea. At least that's what the European Union believed when they sanctioned Malafeyev for these activities. But the kind of Russia's began essentially, I mean, what was important about Putin's asset grab when he and his allies from the security services began taking over the country's strategic cash flows, what was important about it was that they were not just doing so to line their own pockets. There's only so many tens of billions that you can spend on yachts and mansions, but they really were trying to take over the cash flows to, one, prop up their own power within the country, as they had done in St. Petersburg. They needed to create slush funds to win elections, to buy off officials and also rig them within the country. But as Russia became sort of, and its operatives became more and more embedded in Western markets and more successful and welcomed there, they were also able to essentially create these pockets of wealth within Western markets that were pretty intransparent, and be able to kind of utilize them to kind of create the same type of slush funds to buy off Western officials and politicians in the West. So it became sort of a process whereby they were restoring some of their old influence networks. And you only really have to look at the beneficiaries of, the main beneficiaries of Putin's asset grab to see how these sort of old networks of the KGB past were being restored. Because first of all, there was Andrei Akimov, who is the head of Gazprom Bank, which was one of the major beneficiaries of the Putin KGB asset grab. And Andrei Akimov was one of the youngest heads of Donau Bank in Vienna in Soviet times. He is a former, well, we don't get to such a position without very strong ties in the foreign intelligence community. And then there was Gennady Timchenko, whose oil trader Gunvor very much benefited from the takeover of the oil sector, and indeed, as I mentioned before, became the world's third biggest oil trader. And Timchenko himself had known Putin not only from the St. Petersburg years, but also, according to three associates, had also been known Putin since the KGB years and had operated undercover in Vienna and Zurich as a kind of undercover as a trade representative. Mr. Timchenko, of course, denies any ties with the KGB. And then you also had Bank Rossiya, this St. Petersburg bank, which in which Yakunin and another KGB-connected operative, Yuri Kovalchuk, had been the main shareholders. And this was a bank that was also a huge beneficiary of the Putin takeover of cash flows in the 2000s. And so really they were kind of recreating old networks, and in doing so, they kind of created vehicles to begin funding networks on the far left and the far right abroad. I mean, we see the kind of the more conspicuous element of that, and that was a Czech bank, which did have links to Gennady Timchenko at one point, though, again, I would strongly say that he denies this, which gave a considerable amount of money to Front National. And then you have the more kind of hidden elements through kind of various money laundering schemes, which the FSB kind of kept a close eye over and indeed maintained strategic control over. And there was sort of a lot of tens of billions of dollars heading into LLPs and sort of other offshore structures in the West.
Thank you for that, Catherine. I think we'll be returning to this question of non-transparent Russian money abroad and the insidious effects that can have when used to try and buy influence and undermine a transparent political process in Western democracies. I want to come back to that in a moment, but we've got a flood of questions that have come in, and I want to make certain that we have time to go over most of those. Some of them relate to the point you were just touching on, but first, I'd like to talk a bit about succession. There are a few questions that relate to succession. One of them has to do with the question of whether the system that is now in place is somehow reliant on having Putin at the center, or whether this is the sort of thing that somebody else with a similar skill set or political aptitudes could step into as and when Putin exits the scene. I think as a corollary to that, is this system something which will require an ongoing involvement of senior security services to maintain, or is it something that could be continued while moving aside the security services?
I think, yeah, that's a very interesting question. And obviously, you know, it's a really kind of crucial one that will decide Russia's future. I mean, I think what's almost kind of key to see at the moment is that there is sort of rising discontent within parts of the Moscow elite, that they do see sort of Putin, and in particular the security servicemen from St. Petersburg, as having been sort of kind of uniquely heavy-handed, that they have been sort of too aggressive in trying to control the economy, that they have lacked a vision for actually developing the economy, that indeed all they know how to do is to take over cash flows, coerce businesses into sharing rents with them, and then sort of dividing the spoils between themselves and using it to prop up their own power, and then undermine enemies in the West, or perceived enemies in the West at least. And this is really not a very constructive process, because of course, I mean, one of the great drivers of Putin's presidency and of the people around him has been this kind of great desire to restore Russia's role on the world stage. And instead of doing so through kind of creating a powerful economy, they've chosen to do so by kind of taking over rents and then sort of using the cash flows to try and undermine their rivals abroad, which, you know, it's not a very productive policy. And more when I talk to kind of sources in Moscow, or when they're over here, I mean, they sort of rail at the lack of vision, and they rail at the stagnating economy, and at the fact that no one wants to invest, because if you invest, you have to share the proceeds with the security services. I mean, there are lawyers who've been active in the country for decades, and they say now all their clients are in some way or other associated with the Russian state. The banking sector has been, the private banking sector has been decimated. There's only one private bank of note left, Alpha Bank, and everyone else has been taken out by the state. So people are watching decades of work sort of lying in ruins around them, and it's the great question now of what to do. And I think you see even some elements of the sort of Moscow security services, who also sort of the Moscow based, as opposed to kind of Putin's kind of cadre and their roots in St. Petersburg, who just see Putin's group as being kind of uniquely ruthless and heavy-handed, and have perhaps taken things too far. But the question, of course, then is what to do, and how do you dismantle any of this when Putin and his security men hold all the power that they have been able to sort of strengthen control over the legal system and the economy, and essentially anyone who wants to show any sign of opposition faces great risks, not just for their businesses, but also for their personal lives. So, you know, it's a great question. I mean, I think Putin himself is probably quite tired of running Russia by now. 20 years is an extremely long time, and I think probably, and I was told by one of his close allies that I think 2 years ago that he was ready to step down and relax. But the problem is that the way that they've managed to consolidate power over the last 20 years means any handover of power for Putin and his closest inner circle is fraught with risk. I mean, if you just take UCAS, for example, for one example, there have been numerous international court rulings which have stated that the takeover of UCAS was politically motivated. What if the next ruler of Russia were to decide to unravel all of that? That's just one tiny example, and you all know there have been much greater controversies, from apartment bombings to Dubrovka and goodness, and Politkovskaya, and the latest poisoning of Navalny. So it becomes this great risk. And of course, and I think there have been several occasions now, I think once when persuading Dmitry Medvedev to stand aside for Putin's return in 2012, and then in the recent referendum on Putin remaining in power, when his inner circle had very actively actually stepped in and persuaded Putin to stay. So it's become this sort of kind of Soviet era stagnation when there's very little change or glimmer of hope in sight. But I think at some point there will be elements in the system that do want change, but it's a question of how they organize.
And where would you see the most likely effective source of change coming from? The inner circle that we talk about is largely populated by people, trusted, loyal people from the security services. Would they be willing to support somebody who wasn't one of their own number in taking over such a powerful position? Or would they be too concerned that they might be squeezed aside in favor of people from outside of security and maybe from the world of commerce or technocrats? Based on your discussions and your insights, is that a scenario that you think they would be willing to embrace? Of course, they may not have a choice when push comes to shove, depending on the state of the economy at the time and any other brewing crises that may erupt.
Yeah, I think it depends. There are differing degrees of paranoia and risk within that inner circle. I mean, of course, you have the hard men of the Kremlin, Nikolai Patrushev and Igor Sechin, Sechin, for instance, might fancy himself as Russia's next leader at some point, but certainly that would be too risky for others inside that inner circle, because they view that as too destabilizing, that Sechin would grab too much power for himself. And we've seen how ruthless he's been against other actors, that he's been behind sort of the jailing of the former economy minister Alexei Yuliayev, for instance, and other kind of huge takeovers in the economy. So I think those type of people have the most to risk, but sort of as you go down kind of the gradations, there are perhaps others who perhaps think more progressively, but again, everyone within the inner circle, at least, they all have a great deal to lose. So it would, I mean, Putin isn't going to hand over power to anyone that he doesn't know very well. So it's going to be somebody who perhaps is more junior, who again perhaps is able to repeat Putin's experience in kind of demonstrating his loyalty and his lip service to the powers that be. But then again, Putin knows how kind of successful he was able to sort of present himself in that way and still change the system, though he did always protect the Yeltsin family. So it's just a risky business for all involved.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to shift our focus now to outside of Russia, and to look at how Russia's influence operations have been affecting events abroad. We've got several questions, as one might expect, about the relationship between Putin and President Trump. And I think a couple of them relate to Trump's background in real estate. And I think people who were familiar with anti-money laundering rules in the United States after 9/11, they were tightened up across the economy, with one very notable exception, and that is in real estate, where they were relatively lax compared to other sectors. And there's still quite a bit of questionable money coming in for many years after the 9/11 rules were put in place. What can you share with us about your insights into the relationship between not simply Putin, but the broader Russian influence campaign and Donald Trump's real estate background.
Yeah, I think the Trump Organization had always been a very convenient channel via which a lot of illicit former Soviet cash had been laundered. There had been relations established since the very early 90s. In fact, sort of one operator in the Moscow construction business, Shelva Chigirinsky, had met Donald Trump as early as November 1990 when he was running the Taj Mahal casino in Atlantic City, and indeed sort of may have worked to help bail out Trump when he was facing difficulties then. And Chigirinsky's network within Moscow kind of essentially formed the roots of this kind of network of Moscow money men who kind of surrounded Trump ever since. And obviously that kind of the cooperation escalated after 2001, after September 11th, when, as you mentioned, it became much more difficult to funnel cash through the US banking system, and indeed real estate, luxury real estate, became the vehicle of choice. And as one former Trump executive put it, Donald doesn't do due diligence, so it became a very convenient vehicle. And most of all, the operator here was Bayrock, and that was run by two former Soviet emigres in particular, one of whom, Felix Sater, has himself admitted to having quite high-level ties in Russian intelligence, and indeed that's why he was recruited by US intelligence as a kind of an interface between Russian intelligence networks who were funneling information to the CIA and the FBI on Osama bin Laden's mobile telephones and the whereabouts of lost Stinger missiles in Afghanistan, but he wouldn't have been able to act as such an operative for the US intelligence services had he not already been deeply embedded inside the Russian intelligence networks. And it's still a big question really for me whether sort of various elements in the FBI perhaps turned a blind eye to what the Russians were doing with Trump in the Trump Organization, how Bayrock was funneling money through the Trump Organization, because essentially they thought Felix Sater, he's our guy, he's giving his info on Osama bin Laden's mobile phones and other such tidbits, even though Sater was a guy who'd never set foot in Afghanistan and he was clearly being fed by Russian intelligence. So it was kind of a complex game going on there. But I mean, the most important bit, I think, when looking at sort of Trump's operations in the 2000s is that I think he received a great deal of support from Bayrock, which was working on 3 major construction projects with him in the US. There was one in Miami, there was one in Arizona, there was one in Manhattan, Soho, and we were yet to find out the amount of license fees they were paying to Trump, the amount of fees, the management fees they were paying to Trump. Essentially, they were constructing towers which would be emblazoned with the Trump name. Trump gets a cut of the profits, in particular 18% in the Manhattan Soho project, for not doing anything, just for allowing them to use his name on the project. So it's kind of, it's a way for the former Soviet operators to get access to the US market, because yes, it helps to have a big name like Trump on your project. You can then get more funding from US banks for the construction projects. But then when the 2008 crisis comes along, most of these projects went belly up if they hadn't gone belly up before. But it's been suggested that they were still able to walk away with much of the construction cash, stiffing creditors, and we're yet to know how much Trump received from these projects. So we have his tax returns now, courtesy of the New York Times, brilliant reporting, but again, that sort of lacks the specificity for us to see how much he's been receiving from Bayrock. So Trump to the Russians was very much a known entity. He was a very convenient channel through which to to funnel funds. But at some point, I guess, yeah, he became a political opportunity. I think they cultivated him. It's very, yeah, I don't think they were always intending that he was their Manchurian candidate, but I think some of them believed that they'd compromised him as long ago as 1987 when he first visited Moscow. Then one former KGB ally of Putin's has chuckled to me about Trump's penchant for Slavic women. So of course they were watching him closely on all his trips to Moscow, but obviously 2016 election comes along. I'm not sure anyone really expected him to win. I think the Russians wanted to cause the maximum disruption to Hillary Clinton's campaign and then perhaps cast doubt on the results should she win. I don't think anybody in their wildest dreams thought Trump would actually win, but when he did, of course, I think his style of leadership and his calling into question of many of the US alliances that have run the post-Cold War order, again, sort of a KGB man's kind of dream scenario, because we have seen the US's standing in the world and its alliances in the world unravel, and Trump has stepped back from the Middle East. He stepped back from so many kind of outposts of US influence that, yeah, I think which has allowed Putin to also boast that it's the end of liberal democracy, that liberal democracy has had its day. And we've also seen Trump use the State Department, or attempt to use the State Department, for his own political gain. And he's tried to use the kind of parts of the US foreign policy establishment to tarnish his own political rivals. Of course, he's faced great pushback in that, but it's faced a very destructive kind of, it's been very destructive for the institutions of American power.
So for those who feel that liberal democracy should still have a long and healthy life, what do you think can be done by people within those countries to try and shore up their own systems? You've talked about influence operations already. There's been a lot that's been written about corrupt money infiltrating into the banking system, real estate, the legal system, PR systems in the UK and other Western countries. And mind you, this isn't a problem that comes only from Russia, and sometimes it comes from business people within our own societies. But nonetheless, there's been a particular focus on Russia over recent years. What can be done by liberal societies to try and combat that?
Yeah, I think obviously we need to sort of raise our own game as far as transparency is concerned in our own kind of financial markets. I think one of the key ways that the Russian security services have been funneling money into the West is through many of the money laundering schemes that we've heard about, whether it be the Deutsche Bank mirror trade scheme or the Moldovan laundromat, all of which have been overseen by one division of the FSB, the Department K, and we've sort of several associates have told me about that. Essentially, not only does Department K get its cut for turning a blind eye to the schemes, but they can also use the overall outflows, which are mostly customs and tax evasion, sort of funnel their own kind of strategic cash into the West. And it's a great kind of problem that we face now, because there's been sort of tens of billions of dollars flooding out of Russia through these schemes, and most of them have made use of LLPs, which are shell companies in the UK, which don't have to disclose anything. We don't know who their beneficial owners are. They don't even have to have any real business activity in the UK because they don't pay taxes here. So they can just have fake accounts. And once this money is in the system, it's very difficult to trace. So it could go into hedge funds, which is an even bigger, even more transparent part. We know hedge funds don't face barely any disclosure requirements either, and hedge funds too, we know, were very big backers of Brexit. So again, we face a great task in really trying to track some of these money flows and how they've entered our system. And it's the same, as you know, in the US, where LLPs, for instance, might be funding entities like the National Rifle Association, and then the National Rifle Association can make a donation to a super PAC, and the National Rifle Association doesn't have to disclose its source of funds. So it becomes this sort of great cycle of black cash that's going through our political systems, and we can't keep track of any of it. And another kind of case in point is Mr. Aaron Banks, and of course he's already been he's been exonerated by the National Crime Agency. The Electoral Commission had asked for an inquiry into the source of the £8 million that he lent to the Vote Leave campaign, for instance, in 2016. The National Crime Agency found that the money originated from an Isle of Man company that he owned, and that this was a loan to him from the Isle of Man company, but we don't know what the source of funds is in the Isle of Man company. Perhaps, you know, Mr. Banks, of course, says that he has no dealings with any Russians, but the Isle of Man company which was the source of the Vote Leave donation, was a co-shareholder in another Isle of Man company, together with Jim Mellon, who also made a big pile of cash in the Russian markets in the 90s and right up till 2016, though Mr. Mellon also says most of his activity was in Russia within the 90s, and he was hands-off in the 2000s, though he only sold out of his stake in that entity at the end of 2016 after the Brexit vote. So we have this kind of huge tangle that we're kind of trying to get to grips with, and I think sort of one big step in that was the UK Parliamentary Intelligence and Security Committee's Russia report, which kind of laid out some of the issues that we face, that we must kind of have a Foreign Agent Registration Act, for instance, which would force kind of those who are working on behalf of foreign states to disclose who they're acting for, and also then also kind of very stating very clearly that we have to kind of pay more attention to who is making donations in our political systems, and also very clearly kind of pointing out this fact, which I should have mentioned before, that again, after the Khodorkovsky affair, most Russian oligarchs who'd been so independent in the Yeltsin era basically became arms of the Kremlin. So if you have a Russian billionaire operating in London, for instance, you know, it's very likely that every now and then he's conducting operations for the Kremlin, because he has to, you know, he has to take care of his business at home, and he's beholden to the Kremlin to hold on to his assets. And indeed, as one very independent-minded tycoon had told me, that from 2008 onwards, if he gets a call from the Kremlin saying you have to spend 1 billion or 2 billion on this or that strategic operation, you can't say no, you have to comply. So the Russia report stated very clearly that Russian business and the state and the intelligence kind of organs are very, very closely intertwined, that there's almost no barriers between them anymore. So we just have to be kind of have greater due diligence in kind of working with some of these guys.
Mm-hmm. So more transparency, better enforcement of our existing money laundering and transparency laws, and where they're not up to the task, they should be strengthened as well. Shifting a bit now, there is a question about what motivates Putin in his heart of hearts. I mean, we've talked a lot about power, we've talked a lot about interest in money and control, but one question has come in that it said, is there perhaps a more ideological matter? And it's not just an ideological motive relating to restoring Russia, but the question specifically asks about Dugin's sense of passionnarnost. This comes from, I think, Lev Gumilev's research, and this belief that every few generations, a society goes through a type of rebirth when it wants to become powerful and dominant again, and that's a motivating force for Putin, if I understood the question correctly. Can you tell us any insights you've gotten into his own personal views or life, and what may be motivating him beyond the general sense of a desire for power?
I'm afraid it doesn't go much beyond the desire for power. I believe that, you know, I think there is this sort of great sense of humility following the Soviet collapse, humiliation following the Soviet collapse, and that they just want to restore Russia's role on the world stage, and they're quite cynical in the ways that they're prepared to go about doing this. Of course, Putin and many of his ex-KGB allies, of course, have taken on the mantle of the Russian Orthodox Church. And I think they like to believe that they really do believe in orthodoxy, but I think there was one story I was told that was very telling about sort of Putin's own beliefs, that he'd been taken to church one day on Forgiveness Sunday, which is the day in the Orthodox calendar where you're meant to ask everyone for forgiveness, and Putin was in church and essentially refused apparently to ask for forgiveness. He said, "Why should I ask for forgiveness? I'm the president of the Russian Federation." You know, it was a distinct lack of humility and a distinct lack of understanding of the kind of rudimentary kind of fundamentals of the Orthodox belief. I mean, of course, it suits them very well because it's a very conservative religion which doesn't allow for kind of outsiders or anyone really. It's not a very tolerant religion in the sort of, you know, it allows for them to kind of use it to kind of propagate conservative values against LGBT and other kind of things that they might have called in Soviet times inaka mysli, that the outsiders, the dissidents who are outside of the mainstream should be persecuted and punished. And indeed, many of them came from the ranks of the KGB that indeed pursued dissidents in Soviet times, including Yakunin. But one of the former one of Putin's close allies, who was a white Russian descendant and who appears to have been quite instrumental in sort of helping form Putin's views on kind of restoring Russian empire, he essentially said, you know, communism, orthodoxy, it's the same thing, you know, it's just the cement to bind the people together. So it's quite a cynical view. And also Vladimir Yakunin, when I was chatting with him, he also admitted, I mean, he seems to be this great believer in defending conservative values against sort of Western degeneracy, and sort of, he calls it the absolute consumerism of the West, and we're the defenders of the traditional humanist society. But even he admitted that this is just one other element that Russia uses in its battle for influence against the West. He said, yes, before it used to be the communist ideology against capitalists, but now we use these ideals of tradition against kind of consumerism to kind of further our influence. And they've been able, of course, to do that quite successfully, because I noted one question about the interview that Alex Younger, the former MI6 chief, gave to the FT over the weekend, in which he said that sort of Russia didn't create our weaknesses of the West. And of course it didn't, but what Russia has been very able to do is kind of identify the weaknesses in our system. We've had sort of more than a decade of austerity since the 2008 financial crisis, which has created huge social inequalities and many people left by the wayside in globalization, who will hanker for these more traditional values, which then Russia has been able to channel into, and sort of, you know, been able to sort of, while supporting populist leaders in Eastern Europe, for example, and they've won popular support in this way too. So I think the Russians have been quite clever.
So ideology, not necessarily a motivating force for Putin, but a very useful tool in statecraft. Now, we've only got a few minutes left, and I'm afraid we've got many very good questions that we won't be able to get to, but I want to try and just address two, one of which is a huge topic. I'd ask you just to share anything that you think is immediately relevant from the research you've done. Another one of which perhaps has a briefer answer, but I'll ask them both now. Is there anything to say about Putin and his relationship with China, asks one of our participants. And I'm sure there's a lot to say, but is there anything that's come out of your research in particular you think is worth sharing? And the final question is, how is your book being received in Russia?
I'll deal with the first one first, because I'm afraid that's probably the one extremely important area that I haven't looked into closely at all. So maybe I would defer that to the next book talk at Pushkin House, when there'll be someone more expert on this than me. I just haven't really looked into that. And the second question is, how has it been received in Russia? I think at the moment, it's not been translated into Russia. I know that there have been some Russians who've read it and had sort of wildly enthusiastic responses. I think in the Kremlin, it's probably just, I think for them now, it's more kind of water off a duck's back, because of course their own behavior has sort of, they seem to care less about how they're perceived in the West than they might have done, say 6 or 7 years ago when I was in Moscow. I think probably they're not very pleased at some of the descriptions in the book, and in particular sort of digging back into the old kind of networks of the KGB and how they've been resurrected in the present day. I'm sure they're not very pleased about that. But I would like to get it translated into Russian, and then of course we would see really what the reaction is.
Mm-hmm. So since you so elegantly punted on the China question, I have time for one final question that several people asked that I think is very important. You uttered the word humility a while ago, and I think we all should ask ourselves in humility, what is there that the West might have done or should be doing that we haven't, to try and make things better than they are today, if anything, in your view?
I think the West was perhaps a little bit too relaxed and a little, in not really paying attention to Russia and what its sphere of interests were. I think there have been many mistakes made along the way, and I think we allowed ourselves to kind of sit back following the end of the Cold War and believe ourselves the victors, and not really sort of pay attention to the interests or kind of, or processes that were really going on within sort of within Russia. So I think the West just has to perhaps turn attention inwards now and clean up its own processes and improve transparency, which would reduce the scope for meddling by outside hostile actors, which of course are not only Russia but other states as well. So I think we just have to kind of focus more on building our own institutions, because I think probably a lot of people may have forgotten some of the principles, which kind of put the West in a position of superiority following the Cold War in the first place.
Catherine, that's a fabulous note to end this on. And I just want to underscore how important investigative journalism like yours is to that very question. It helps us to raise our awareness where we haven't been aware. And it's a clarion call to us to action where we've been perhaps a bit too lax and too negligent. And it helps us understand as a society what the challenges are that we face internally as well as externally, and to be able to better demand accountability from our government and our business leaders as well. So I want to thank you again for the incredible effort that you've made over many of these years to pull this story together and then to bring it in such an elegant and vivid fashion as you have in your book to the public. And I'd like to thank everybody this evening for joining us for this Pushkin House talk. It's been fabulous to get your questions. We wish we could have handled more. Hopefully there'll be another time, another venue where we can continue this conversation. So thanks again to everyone for participating. Catherine's book is available for sale through the Pushkin House bookshop, which is online, and we do deliver. So with that, thanks everybody for joining, and Catherine Belton, thank you very much for a fantastic book and for sharing your time and your thoughts with us tonight.
Well, thank you so much to everyone for joining, and thank you for such great questions to you, Craig, and to everyone who wrote. Sorry, I wasn't able to answer all of them.
Good night.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thank you.